Elliot Pearson adjusted the lapel of his navy blue blazer and sighed as he glanced around the crowded ballroom. He wasn't sure why he had come. These events, literary galas with endless speeches and socialites pretending to care about books, always left him feeling like an imposter. He tugged at his bow tie, already regretting his decision to attend. His latest novel had received more praise than he was comfortable with, and the organizers insisted on honoring him tonight. Elliot was no stranger to the literary spotlight, but it always made him feel like a jester in a court full of royalty, only as welcome as his latest clever remark. He scanned the room, sipping a glass of overpriced champagne as conversation buzzed around him. Women in glittering dresses and men in sleek tuxedos drifted from one cluster to another, exchanging empty pleasantries. No one seemed particularly interested in the books on display. Most guests had come to see and be seen. Elliot leaned against a tall marble column, content to remain an observer. He had built a reputation for sharp humor and subtle insults, and he knew how dangerous it was to let down his guard in a room full of egos. The champagne, though uninspiring, kept his hands busy, and he took small sips to pass the time. "Mr. Pearson," a voice startled him from behind. He turned to see Laura Grant, a young journalist he vaguely recognized. She had dark, inquisitive eyes and a notebook clutched against her chest, her expression one of cautious excitement. "Laura, isn't it?" Elliot greeted her with a half-smile. "What brings you to this carnival?" Laura laughed nervously. "I'm hoping to interview you for my magazine, if you have a moment, of course." Elliot raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll make a deal with you. I'll answer your questions if you promise to tell me the truth. Why on earth do people come to these things?" Laura's eyes sparkled with amusement. "To feel important, I imagine." Elliot chuckled, delighted by her honesty. A refreshingly accurate answer. "All right, Laura, I'll give you your interview, after I survive this ordeal." Laura smiled, clearly pleased. Deal. The evening dragged on, with speeches that droned longer than the guests' patience and applause that felt obligatory rather than genuine. Elliot kept to himself, offering occasional nods to acquaintances but avoiding deeper conversation. Then, just as he considered slipping out unnoticed, Clara Thornton arrived. Elliot noticed her instantly. Clara had that kind of beauty that demanded attention, the kind that made people feel both fascinated and inadequate. She glided into the room wearing an emerald green gown that shimmered under the chandelier lights. Her blonde hair swept elegantly to one side. Clara Thornton was a high society icon, known as much for her wealth as for her withering sense of superiority. She wasn't the kind of person who read books, she collected them as decor. Her world was one of charity galas and private jets, far removed from Elliot's gritty, satirical world of literary storytelling. Elliot watched her from the corner of the room, amused by the way the crowd parted for her. She greeted people with polite indifference, her smile more an obligation than an expression. Clara Thornton did not admire people, she tolerated them. And then, somehow, her gaze landed on him. "Mr. Pearson," Clara said smoothly as she approached, a glass of champagne in hand. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Elliot gave her a small, polite nod. "Ms. Thornton, I rarely come to these events, but I was feeling reckless." Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, I hope you're enjoying yourself." Elliot tilted his head. "I always enjoy watching the dance of human vanity. Tonight has been particularly entertaining." Clara's laugh was light but dismissive. "Oh, Elliot, always so clever, aren't you?" He smiled faintly, already sensing that this conversation would end in some kind of disaster. Still, he couldn't resist engaging. He loved games like these, verbal fencing matches where both parties tried to outwit the other. "You look radiant tonight," Elliot said, raising his glass in a casual toast. "That gown suits you perfectly." Clara gave him a slow, appraising look, her lips curving into a sly smile. "How kind of you. Pity I can't say the same about you." The words landed with the precision of a knife. And for a moment, Elliot felt the eyes of nearby guests turn toward them. Clara had delivered her insult casually, expecting Elliot to wither under her charm and walk away humiliated. But Elliot Pearson was no stranger to sharp words, and he had no intention of backing down. He smiled, calm, deliberate. "That's quite all right, Clara. You could always do what I did. Just say something dishonest." The room went silent, and Clara's smile faltered. For a moment, she looked stunned, like a queen whose crown had been snatched from her head in front of her court. The guests around them stifled their laughter, amused by the unexpected reversal. Clara blinked, clearly not used to being outmaneuvered. She forced a tight smile and gave a small, dismissive shrug. "Touché, Mr. Pearson." Elliot raised his glass again, this time in genuine amusement. "To honesty." Then, Clara nodded, but the embarrassment lingered on her face. She gave a brief, polite farewell and walked away, leaving Elliot standing alone once more, but this time with a small, satisfied smile. This was Elliot's world, a world where wit was his shield, and words were his weapons. And tonight, he had won a small victory. But victories like these always came at a cost. He just didn't know it yet. Clara Thornton sat in the back of her limousine, the city lights of Manhattan flickering past the windows. Her driver navigated the bustling streets with practiced ease. But Clara barely noticed. Her mind kept returning to the exchange with Elliot Pearson. She'd been humiliated, and in front of people who mattered. No one had ever spoken to her that way. At least not since she had learned how to make her beauty, wealth, and status her armor. She ran a hand through her blonde hair, replaying Elliot's words. You could always do what I did. Just say something dishonest. The simplicity of it burned. It wasn't just that he had insulted her, he had exposed her. The limousine glided to a halt in front of her penthouse building. Clara stepped out without a word to her driver, her heels clicking against the pavement. When she reached the elevator, she caught sight of her reflection in the sleek metal doors. Her green gown shimmered, the image of elegance, but tonight, the gown felt more like a costume than a triumph. Inside her penthouse, Clara poured herself a glass of wine and kicked off her heels. The city skyline stretched out before her, sparkling like a sea of diamonds. She usually found comfort in the view, but tonight it felt distant, like a stage set for a life that no longer fit her. Elliot Pearson sat at the small desk in his apartment, staring at the blank page on his laptop screen. He'd come out victorious tonight, but the triumph felt hollow. Clara Thornton was exactly the kind of person who irritated him, shallow, vain, and dismissive. He should have felt satisfied putting her in her place. And yet, he didn't. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair and sighed. He knew why the victory felt empty, because he was just as much a prisoner to vanity as Clara was. The difference was that Clara hid behind beauty, and Elliot hid behind humor. A knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. It was Laura Grant, the young journalist, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Hope I'm not interrupting, Laura said with a smile. I figured you could use a break. Elliot waved her in. Come in. I was just trying to decide whether to start a new novel or run away to an island. Laura laughed and handed him one of the coffees. Well, I vote for the novel. Elliot took a sip, grateful for the distraction. What brings you here, Laura? Already planning my next profile? Actually, I wanted to talk to you about Clara Thornton, Laura said, sitting across from him. I was there when you two had that little exchange. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Ah, yes, the dance of egos. Do you ever regret being so sharp with people? Laura asked curiously. Elliot hesitated, then shrugged. Not usually. People like Clara Thornton need to be reminded that they aren't invincible. Laura tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe, or maybe people like her don't need reminders, they need second chances. Elliot smirked. You're very wise for someone so young. I read a lot, Laura quipped. So, will you write about it? The exchange, I mean. Elliot leaned back in his chair. He wasn't sure yet, but one thing was certain. Clara Thornton wasn't going to disappear from his thoughts anytime soon. The days following the gala did not go as Clara expected. At first, she dismissed Elliot's remark as an unfortunate incident, a hiccup in an otherwise flawless image. But then she noticed the shift in how people treated her. Her closest friends began to distance themselves subtly. Invitations to exclusive events became fewer. Gossip spread. The high society world Clara had built her life around was less forgiving than she thought. The whispers followed her everywhere. She's slipping. Did you hear what happened at the gala? Pearson embarrassed her. At first, Clara tried to maintain her composure, pretending nothing had changed. But each small slight, each subtle rejection, felt like another crack in the carefully constructed armor she wore. One afternoon, she ran into Henry Thornton, her ex-husband, at a cafe. Henry looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his expression tired. He was far from the powerful businessman he once was. Henry, Clara said, surprised to see him. I didn't think you still came to this part of town. Henry gave her a wry smile. I don't, usually, but life has a way of humbling us. Doesn't it? Clara frowned, not sure how to respond. Was that what was happening to her? Was she being humbled? Elliot Pearson was not one to receive letters, especially not handwritten ones. So when the small envelope with Clara Thornton's elegant handwriting arrived at his apartment, he was both curious and suspicious. He opened it carefully, unfolding the thick stationery. The note was brief but surprising. Mr. Pearson, I owe you an apology. My behavior at the gala was unbecoming, and I deeply regret it. I hope you will forgive my rudeness. If you are willing, I would like to invite you to dinner so we can begin again. Sincerely, Clara Thornton. Elliot stared at the letter. Bemused, a socialite offering an apology? That was rare. He considered ignoring it, but something in the tone of the letter intrigued him. With a sigh, he reached for his phone and texted Laura. Elliot. What's your take on second chances? Laura. Depends. Are you the one giving it or taking it? Elliot. Dinner with Clara Thornton. Laura. Oof. I say go. You never know, you might actually like her. Elliot chuckled at Laura's response. He folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into his pocket. Why not? He thought. It might make a good story. Elliot arrived at L'Antoine, an upscale restaurant tucked away in the heart of Manhattan. He wasn't sure what to expect. Was Clara Thornton attempting an apology out of genuine regret? Or was this dinner just another performance in her carefully managed social life? He adjusted his coat and walked inside. The maitre d' greeted him with a subtle nod. Ms. Thornton is waiting for you. When Elliot reached the private dining room, he found Clara seated at a small table, wearing a black dress that was understated but elegant. She looked up from her wine glass and gave him a tentative smile. Thank you for coming, she said softly. I didn't think you would. Elliot took the seat across from her, watching her carefully. I'm just as curious as you are about why I came. Clara's smile faltered slightly. I deserved that. The waiter arrived, taking their drink orders, and an awkward silence followed. Clara, for once, looked uncertain, a woman used to controlling every situation, now sitting across from someone who had stripped away her defenses. I want to apologize, Clara said finally, her voice steady but sincere. The way I spoke to you at the gala, it was thoughtless. I've spent the past few days thinking about why I said what I did. And I realized, I've made a habit of dismissing people. Elliot arched an eyebrow. That's quite a revelation. Clara gave a small laugh. But there was no malice in it. I'm not proud of it. I suppose, it's easier to hide behind arrogance than to admit when you feel inadequate. Elliot tilted his head, intrigued. This wasn't the Clara Thornton he had expected. Why tell me this? Because, Clara said quietly, I think you know exactly what that feels like. Elliot leaned back, surprised by her insight. She had seen right through him. As the night wore on, the conversation between Clara and Elliot deepened. They talked about the pressures of public life, the facades they wore to survive in their respective worlds, and the loneliness that came with them. Elliot found himself admitting things he rarely said aloud, that writing had become more about expectations than passion, that his wit was often a shield against his own insecurities. Clara, in turn, shared stories from her childhood, how she had been taught from a young age that beauty was power. But that power came at a price. I've spent so long being admired, she said, that I forgot what it's like to be understood. For the first time in a long while, Elliot felt a connection that wasn't built on pretense or humor. The next morning, Elliot called Laura Grant to tell her about the dinner. Laura listened carefully, her curiosity piqued. So, what do you think of Clara now? She's complicated, Elliot admitted. There's more to her than I thought. Laura grinned on the other end of the line. See? I told you. Second chances can surprise you. Elliot chuckled. You might be right. Laura paused, then asked, do you think you'll see her again? Elliot hesitated. He wasn't sure where this strange new relationship with Clara was heading. But for the first time in years, he wasn't in a rush to define it. Maybe, he said finally. Maybe. Despite their attempt at privacy, news of Elliot and Clara's dinner soon found its way into the gossip columns. Rumors spread quickly, each one more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed they were dating. Others speculated that Clara was using Elliot to repair her damaged reputation. Elliot, accustomed to public scrutiny, brushed off the gossip with his usual humor. But Clara was less comfortable with the rumors swirling around her. For someone who had always controlled how people saw her, this new narrative, vulnerable, unpredictable, felt terrifying. At the same time, something strange happened. Clara began to care less. For the first time in her life, the opinions of high society elites mattered a little less than the genuine conversations she was starting to have with Elliot. Over the following weeks, Elliot and Clara continued to meet, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for long walks in the park, and occasionally for late-night conversations over wine. Their friendship was unexpected but real, built not on pretense but on the shared understanding of two people who had learned to mask their vulnerabilities in different ways. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the Hudson River, Clara asked, do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you didn't have to be clever all the time? Elliot smiled, a little sadly. All the time. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. And for once, Elliot didn't feel the need to say anything witty. The more Clara distanced herself from her old social circle, the more she began to rediscover parts of herself she had long buried. She reconnected with old friends she had once dismissed and began volunteering at a local community center, a place far removed from the glitz and glamour of her previous life. At first, the work felt awkward, unfamiliar, but over time, Clara found genuine joy in helping others. Realizing that fulfillment didn't come from admiration, it came from connection. Not everything was smooth sailing. Henry Thornton, Clara's ex-husband, reached out unexpectedly, seeking reconciliation. He had fallen on hard times, and though Clara no longer loved him, she offered him forgiveness. "It doesn't mean I want you back," Clara told him gently, "but I think we both need to let go of the past." Henry nodded, grateful for the closure. It was a small step toward redemption, for both of them. Inspired by his friendship with Clara, Eliot finally began writing again. His new novel wasn't a satire or a critique, it was a story about second chances, humility, and the power of human connection. As he typed late into the night, Eliot felt something he hadn't felt in years: genuine excitement. He wasn't writing for awards or acclaim, he was writing because the story mattered. Months later, Eliot's novel was released to critical acclaim. At the book launch, Clara stood proudly beside him, her transformation complete. She had let go of the arrogance that once defined her, and in its place, she had found something far more meaningful: a sense of self. Unburdened by the need for validation. Laura Grant's article about their journey, titled "The Power of Second Chances," captured the public's imagination, sparking conversations about the importance of humility in an age obsessed with appearances. One autumn afternoon, Eliot and Clara met once more on their favorite bench by the river. The air was crisp, and the leaves had begun to turn golden. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. "Do you think we've changed?" Clara asked quietly. Eliot smiled. "I think we've become who we were meant to be." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. And Eliot knew, for the first time in his life, he didn't need to be clever. He just needed to be present. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all. Months after Eliot's book launch, life seemed quieter but more meaningful for both Eliot and Clara. Clara, now fully immersed in her volunteer work, had developed a genuine passion for community service. She no longer attended the exclusive galas that once defined her life. She didn't need them anymore. Eliot's novel, Second Chances, had become a surprise bestseller. But for the first time in his career, the reviews didn't matter to him. He had written the book he needed to write, and that was enough. On a crisp winter evening, Clara invited Eliot to a small gathering at the community center where she now volunteered. "It's nothing fancy," she warned with a smile. "Just some food and music." Eliot raised an eyebrow, amused. "Sounds perfect." The community center buzzed with warmth and laughter. Families gathered around folding tables, and children ran between the chairs, their giggles filling the air. It was a world away from the high society galas Clara once frequented. But it felt more real than anything she had experienced before. Eliot arrived, hands stuffed into the pockets of his wool coat, scanning the room for Clara. He found her serving food at one of the tables, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with joy. When she saw him, she waved him over. "Welcome to the glamorous world of volunteer work," she teased, handing him a plate of food. Eliot laughed. Much better than champagne and speeches. They sat at a table with some of the community members Clara had come to know. Eliot listened as she introduced him to the people she had befriended, people whose lives were far removed from the superficial circles they had both once inhabited. For the first time in years, Eliot felt something he hadn't expected: contentment. Meanwhile, Laura Grant was working on a follow-up article to her original piece about Eliot and Clara. She had spent weeks interviewing them, learning about their friendship, their transformations, and the unexpected places life had taken them. In one of her interviews with Eliot, she asked, "Do you think people really change? Or do we just learn to live with our flaws?" Eliot had smiled thoughtfully. "I think real change happens when we stop pretending we don't have flaws. That's when we start becoming who we're meant to be." Laura titled her new article "The Beauty of Imperfection." It became one of the most widely read features in the magazine's history, sparking conversations about authenticity and personal growth. One rainy afternoon, Clara received an unexpected call from Henry Thornton, her ex-husband. He was moving out of the city and wanted to meet one last time before he left. They met at a quiet cafe near the park where they used to walk when they were first married. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with memories of the life they once shared, and the mistakes they had made. "I've learned a lot since we divorced," Henry said quietly, stirring his coffee, "and I wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Clara smiled softly. She had waited years to hear those words, but now that they were here, she realized she no longer needed them. "I forgive you, Henry," she said simply, "and I hope you find what you're looking for." Henry nodded, visibly relieved. As they parted ways, Clara felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. One snowy morning, Elliot and Clara sat at their favorite spot by the Hudson River. Bundled in coats and scarves, they had come to this place many times over the months, each visit a reminder of the journey they had taken together. "I've been thinking," Clara said, her breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe it's time for something new. A new chapter." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "What kind of chapter?" Clara smiled. "The kind where we stop sitting on the sidelines and actually build something together." Elliot tilted his head, curious. "And what do you suggest we build?" "A foundation," Clara said, "one that focuses on literacy, creativity, and community. Something that combines everything we've learned along the way." Elliot smiled slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. "You know, I think I like that." In the months that followed, Elliot and Clara poured their energy into building the Thornton Pearson Foundation. The foundation offered creative writing workshops for young people, provided grants for local artists, and supported literacy programs in underfunded communities. For Elliot, the foundation became a way to reconnect with the passion that had driven him to write in the first place. For Clara, it was a way to give back and find purpose beyond the narrow world of high society. At the launch event for the foundation, Clara gave a short speech. "This foundation is about more than just words on a page," she said. "It's about building a community where everyone's story matters." The audience erupted in applause, and Clara smiled at Elliot, who stood beside her. This was the life she had never imagined for herself, and it was better than anything she could have dreamed. Years later, the Thornton Pearson Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations. Children who once struggled to read were now writing stories of their own. And artists who had once felt invisible were now thriving. Elliot and Clara, now older but no less curious about life, sat together on a park bench one last time. Their friendship had withstood gossip, personal crises, and the passing of years, and it was stronger than ever. As the sun set over the Hudson River, Clara turned to Elliot with a smile. "Do you think we've finally figured it out?" Elliot chuckled. "Probably not, but I think we're closer than we were." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. Content. The journey they had taken together, one that began with a sharp remark at a gala, had led them to something far more meaningful. A life built on humility, connection, and second chances. And in the end, that was more than enough. Story of Elliot and Clara with a message of growth, redemption, and lasting connection. Their journey from arrogance to humility, from isolation to community, reflects the novel's deeper themes. That transformation is always possible. And that life is richer when we let go of pretense and embrace authenticity.